we celebrated the 4th of July 2 weeks ago. We set another world's record. Nobody's been as long under the same piece of paper as we've been under that piece of paper. Now, there's 192 nations at the UN this year. That number goes up and down every year. Do you guys realize we are the only one out of the 192 nations that does not average a revolution every 30 to 40 years? I think it's pretty cool that we don't have a revolution every generation. Now, you look anywhere else in the world that's going on. You look at France, they've had 15 governments while we've had just one. If you jump over to Poland there in the center, Poland's had 7 governments since 1921. If you jump over to the far edge there on the right, Russia's had 4 governments since 1917. You jump further off the map, you go to Afghanistan, they had 5 governments in the 20th century, 5 constitutions in the 20th century. They've already had another one this century. I mean, we're the most stable nation in the history of the world by a long shot. Nobody else even comes close. We're also the most prosperous nation in the world. You see, we have only 4% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's wealth. Did you know that according to figures from the U.S. Census Bureau, if you live below poverty, and we don't want anybody living below poverty in America, but if you live below the poverty level in America, you are more likely to own a telephone, a television, you're more likely to have an air conditioner, you're more likely to have an automobile, you're more likely to eat more red meat and have more square footage of living space than the average middle class in Europe. Did you get that? If you live below the poverty level in America, you're higher than the middle class in Europe. Do you realize how blessed we have been in this country? I mean, it's unbelievable the blessings we enjoy. And this is called American exceptionalism. That was a term given us back in 1831 by Alexis de Tocqueville, French historian who came here and saw this, said this is exceptional. I don't think any other nation will ever do what the Americans have. Now, what philosophy produced American exceptionalism? Well, to know that philosophy, we go back to the guys who gave us that philosophy, the Founding Fathers. They tell us what that philosophy is in 45 simple words at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. 45 simple words. They say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Now, that's the core of American exceptionalism, and out of that, there are 3 very simple principles that come out. We, from a government standpoint, not individuals, yeah, individuals too, but the government says, hey, we in the government believe that there's a creator. Number 1, that's what our document says. We acknowledge there's a creator. Number 2, we believe that that creator gives certain guaranteed rights to man. And number 3, we believe government exists to secure the rights that God gives to every individual. Not collective, as Glenn said. It's not collective, it's individual stuff. Now, if you don't get that philosophy down, you will never have limited government. You can't have limited government, and that's what these guys understood. Limited government comes from that, because if our rights don't come from God, they must come from man. They must come from government. And if government gives you something, government has a right to take away from you or to regulate or to abolish whatever it gives. Therefore, if rights come from man, if they come from government, government's allowed to get into every single stinking thing out there. Only if you recognize that there's a God, He gives rights, and we exist to protect what He's given. Therefore, we can't touch those rights. That's the only way you ever have limited government. Limited government's not the size of government. It's the intrusion and the scope of government. It's what it gets into. And see, that's what the Founding Fathers understood. Now, when you see that document, you see the philosophy that we call American exceptionalism, you know, it sounds to me like the founders were talking pretty strong about faith in God. And, of course, today we're told, oh, no, secular nation, godless constitution, Founding Fathers, atheist, agnostics, deists. You know, it is an interesting thing about these guys. Fortunately for us, everything is recorded. They did on paper what we do with cameras and tapes and VCRs. They wrote it all down. George Washington has 100 volumes of published writings. John Adams has 33. You have Ben Franklin with 40. You have Madison with 60. You have Hamilton with 60. I mean, these guys wrote everything down. And it's interesting that they even wanted to make sure that we had access to it. So in Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 3 of the U.S. Constitution, they required that everything that happens on the floor of the House and Senate be recorded in public records so that we can see it. Which means, for that reason, you can go this day to the records of Congress. You can go back to the very first day Congress ever met, or you can even look in a library and see that. If you go back to day 1 of the records of Congress, what you will find is the first time that our Founding Fathers, first time these guys got together, they opened with prayer, September the 6th, 1774. And as you read there in the records of Congress, you say, well, that's not a dinky little prayer, is it? No, it wasn't. According to historical records, the opening prayer session in Congress ran for right at 2 hours. Now, that is an interesting way for the founding. You know, we can't get this happening in religious bodies, but we get our Founding Fathers in Congress, and they didn't just pray that morning. John Adams wrote a lengthy letter describing describing what had happened to Abigail. John said that that morning in Congress, not only did they pray, but they studied 4 chapters of the Bible in Congress. And he said during the Bible study, Psalm 35 so jumped off the page at them. God made that so alive to them, changed their whole attitude on the American Revolution. So what did he do? Well, in describing this to Abigail, here's what he told her. He said, Abigail, he said, I must beg you to read that psalm. Read the 35th Psalm to your friends. Read it to your fathers. He wanted everybody to know, us included, what God had shown them that morning in a Bible study in Congress. He wanted all of us to read Psalm 35, and he said, read it to your friends, read to your father, and her father was the pastor of their church, the Reverend William Smith. I mean, he wants everybody knowing what happened in Bible study that morning in Congress. But it didn't just stop there. Back in that very first Congress, as John told Abigail, he said, Abigail, he said, we've appointed a continental fast. He said, millions will be up on their knees at once before their great Creator, imploring His forgiveness and blessings, His smiles on American council and arms. He said, can you imagine the impact of having 3 million Americans pray and fast for what's happening? Now, remarkable stuff. That was the first of 15 times that Congress called the nation to prayer. That was a day of prayer and fasting. Congress also had days of prayer and thanksgiving. Usually after you had a day of prayer and fasting, 4, 5, 6 months later in the records of Congress, you'll say, the congressman will say, you remember when we prayed and fasted? Man, look at all the answers to prayer we've had. Let's have a day of thanksgiving. And so 15 times in the Revolution, it goes back and forth between a time of prayer and fasting, a time of prayer and thanksgiving. These guys were so into prayer that when you look at all the prayer proclamations issued by founding fathers, by 1815, we have 1,400 official prayer proclamations calling Americans to prayer. Doesn't sound like a bunch of secular guys. Sounded like faith was pretty important to them. Sounded like they wanted us to get a hold of God, make sure God. These are government calls to prayer. 1,400 by 1815? Absolutely. See, faith was important to these guys. Now, 2 years later, when these same guys got together and they did our Declaration of Independence, these 56 signers that we have, you know, that document is so remarkable. It has ideas never contained in any other previous written document. And you go, where'd they get their ideas? Well, again, because they are writers, they tell us where they get their ideas. I mean, if you go and look at the writings, for example, of Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, if you look at John Adams there, that's James Wilson. If you look at this man over here, Benjamin Rush, they all tell us that they copied the Declaration out of this work, the 2 Treatises of Government by John Locke. Now, it used to be that if you went to school in America in government class, we always studied the 2 Treatises of Government because all these guys said the Declaration. Matter of fact, this guy on the left, Richard Henry Lee, and he's the guy that made the motion in Congress on June the 5th that we separate from Great Britain. As a result of that motion, they said, well, let's get a document together. So they appointed the 5 guys at the table to write the Declaration. Richard Henry Lee's the guy who got this whole thing started. Richard Henry Lee said that they, quote, copied the Declaration from those 2 Treatises of Government by John Locke. Now, that's why we used to study it in school, because if you're going to study government, you need to know where it came from. If you're going to know where it came from, you got to study John Locke. But we don't study that today. We haven't studied that probably in a good 40 or 50 years. I wonder why. Because the document, the book, now that book's small. It's less than 400 pages thick, less than 400 pages long, but it's less than 1 inch thick. If you look at that document, you will find that that book cites the Bible over 1,500 times to show the proper operation of civil government. We say, whoa, I thought government was secular. Well, good thing for us, they didn't think so. They think God should be involved in everything. That little book, 1,500 Bible verses on how government should operate, and it was from there that they copied the Declaration. No wonder we've lasted longer than any other nation. We had a different foundation, different philosophy at the beginning. This is what caused American exceptionalism. You'll find that throughout the Revolution. Matter of fact, by the time you get to 1781, the Battle of Yorktown, the British lay down their arms. We now are officially out from under the laws of the kings. Now, the reason that becomes important is prior to that, we had laws. For example, one of the laws that had been put by the kings on America, even 150 years earlier, said, if you live in America, you cannot print any Bible in the English language in America. Great Britain had a national, worldwide denomination for them. Whatever the king was, if the king's Anglican, will be Anglican. If the king's Catholic, will be Catholic. Whatever Bible he uses, that's what we all use. That's what he tells us. Well, as a result of the American Revolution, we're no longer under